The technology to make nuclear weapons is spreading.
Terrorist groups are prepared to engage in mass casualty attacks.
Americans are not especially well prepared to respond.
The United States wanted nuclear weapons out of fear that the Nazis would get it first. I think that was the reason that a lot of scientists, physicists who really had no interest in developing weapons of mass destruction decided to throw all their energy into developing a nuclear weapon. And so it was quite an endeavor involving the best scientists of the day, many of whom had fled Nazi Germany, to actually create this nuclear weapon. In the process of creating it, many decided that it had to be used. I mean, there were many scientists who deeply opposed the actual use. And some felt it should be demonstrated on an island with the Japanese present. But I think the overall decision by particularly the political leadership of the United States was it had to be used. And we know the effects. They were devastating. 2 cities destroyed, hundreds of thousands of people killed, and these were small nuclear weapons. And any country watching that would know that whoever has the bomb is going to be powerful and those who don't are going to be weak. And so by the development and use of nuclear weapons, it was almost guaranteed that others would follow suit, and it's no mistake that Russia went first.
The United States hoped that it would keep its nuclear monopoly for a long time, but its monopoly didn't last very long. The Soviet Union acquired its capability in 1949. Then, of course, it was followed by the British and the French, then the Chinese in 1964.
A mushroom of smoke rises more than 20 miles away in the first pictures released by the Defense Department of America's new atomic weapon in action.
As tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated into the 50s, I mean, there was really a worry in the United States that a nuclear war could happen. There was a belief that if we're going to fight a nuclear war, then you have to have a robust civil defense or protect the civilians. And so a lot of thought was put into how do you reduce the number of deaths in a nuclear war.
Here are some older boys showing what to do if the flash comes when you are not in the classroom. This is what to do if you should be in a corridor. You duck and cover tight against the wall this way. Remember to keep your face and the back of your neck covered tightly.
A nuclear strike against the United States would have been devastating, and no civil defense would have been possible. But nonetheless, that's not what the United States government was going to tell its people. So instead, they had these exercises, and I went through some of them as a kid, where you're brought into a hallway of a school.
Dum dum, diddle dum dum, diddle dum dum.
I was a school child in those years, and I remember the duck and cover drills as if, putting your head down and getting under your desk is going to give you much protection from a 10, 20 kiloton explosion. If you were anywhere near that explosion, you would be vaporized, whether you were under your desk or not.
With the knowledge of the first atomic explosions to guide us, our chances for survival will be far better than those of the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
There was a lot of that. I remember in the 50s, the fad was for fallout shelters. And you were encouraged to get bottled water and all kinds of provisions and store them in some underground location. People at the time actually spent a lot of money for, high-tech, at that time, fallout shelter. But it soon became clear that those kinds of activities were really futile.
Duck and cover.
If you go back and look during the Cold War, at that time, all emergency management in this country was called civil defense. And if you remember the placards on basements and subways, and that was fallout shelters, and they exercised, large cities. The sirens would go off and people would evacuate to the shelters. We don't have that today. There's no city, state, or federal that has all the resources that they could possibly have to be able to meet a Katrina type event if we had another one or two.
Every other country in the world knows that the use of nuclear weapons against the U.S. would be suicidal. So I think deterrence will hold. What I'm concerned about are the rogue elements, the individuals, the terrorists, who may get their hands on a nuclear device or on the fissile material to make a nuclear device. Today we have a situation where you have suicidal terrorists who cannot be deterred. There's nothing you can threaten them with. They're prepared to die for their beliefs. So how can they be deterred? If they get their hands on nuclear weapons will be used.
Most experts thought that was outside of what terrorists could really do. That's no longer the case. But unfortunately, we're entering an era where there's enough nuclear explosive that isn't fully protected, where the technology to make nuclear weapons is spreading.
So that's pretty clear. The threat is out there. We don't know how successful they've been. Clearly, it's the terrorist intention to get their hands on the material, fabricate the devices, and detonate them.
After 9/11, I mean, we had to work extensively on, what are the chances terrorists could make nuclear weapons, and then how do you, in a sense, deal with the consequences if they succeed?
Because of all the money and because of all the effort that went in after 9/11 to making emergency response systems so good in this country, Hurricane Katrina had the potential to be the greatest success story in American disaster medicine, but ended up falling apart just because of the lack of agencies being able to really communicate with each other. Preparedness in general, one of the main challenges is getting the public to understand that this is something they need to be a part of in terms of preparing oneself, preparing yourself as a community, as well as being prepared from the federal, state, and local level as responders.
The biggest weakness is not necessarily in the plans, but the biggest weakness is communication. Information sharing at different levels, deciding who's in charge. Because of course, when you have different agencies coming in that are used to being in charge, they all think they're in charge.
One of the biggest problems we have in this country today right now is the inoperability of public safety communications. Every fire department, every police department, every public safety entity has their own systems, and none of them are compatible.
When we talk about communication systems, there's two things we need to talk about. We need to talk about the walkie-talkies and the computers and the internet. The other aspect of communication is communications between agencies or between resources and between the public and between the mayor's office and the police department and the fire department. So there's technical communications as well as interactive communications. And what we saw certainly with Hurricane Katrina was a failure of both.
One advantage of having planning and doing drills and exercises beforehand is people get to know each other. Quite frankly, a lot of it is the social interactions. If you know the person who's your counterpart at the state level or something, you'll feel much more comfortable sharing information with them. And that's really a very important part of the whole thing. But at every level, communications and a clear line of command turn out to be the biggest problems in actually doing these responses.
One of the things that people tend to not realize that they need to look at what is their family going to do. Have a family plan, make a family plan. It can make life so much easier and the recovery so much better. And I think they would feel much better knowing that they had that prepared.